Hello, I am a high priest of the economicon. My name is the economancer. My life's work is to show you the sacred passages of the economicon in a digestible form. Today we're going to be discussing the Laffer Curve. To discuss this Laffer Curve, we're going to have to look at taxation. Something to note about taxation is that labor income taxation makes up the bulk of taxes and government revenue. This is a rather new idea in human history, where in previous centuries, tariffs were a large portion of a government's revenue system. And before the manifestation of capitalism, the main mechanism for a government to increase revenue was stealing. This was done via conquering and control of assets, such as stealing the labor and value from peasants and serfs. The Laffer curve is a curve for optimal taxation. Below me, for the U2, I have the normal distribution plotted. This is what the Laffer curve looks like in general. A quick breakdown of Laffer. So Laffer had concluded that there is an optimal point on tax structure that maximizes the amount of revenue a government can collect by reducing taxes. Now, the reason why we care about this is that one of the general guiding principles for taxing is you want to collect revenue as maximal as possible with the least amount of damage to your private sector. Because taxes do damage the private sector as they distort certain market signals, since an agent has these signals distorted, this might cause what is known as an efficient resource allocation decline. This may cause taxes to create market failures, but we kind of set this off with this cost-benefit ratio with public goods to outweigh these damages or at least attempt to break even. So Laffer had concluded at the time of the Ford administration that Americans were paying way too much in taxes, and that if we reduced taxes, we would be in a more optimal place on the Laffer curve to increase revenue, as the taste or the elasticity of tax would spur more people to pay taxes since it was a lower amount. Now, the Laffer curve has faced many criticisms, such as Laffer's inability to have a discontinuity that would lead to a revenue maximizing tax solution. This discontinuity assumes that if we have the government that is trying to maximize their revenue so that they can have you know as much as the public goods and services as possible, then there might be a break in this collection due to numerous constraints. And I'm going to sum up these constraints rather quickly. There is the informational or asymmetric information constraint. The government does not have 100% of the information on individual tastes, preferences, or even your income. And since we have like a progressive tax system in the United States, that is why during tax season there's a ton of information gathering happening. You got to go, you got to fill out your taxes, or you have to have an accountant, etc., etc. This is so the government can obtain the information so it can conclude on what it strategizes as optimal taxation. Now, there's an administrative or capacity of the state itself constraint. So, governments around the world are not the same. I think we can all agree to that. They can implement possibly more or less complex taxing programs, and they also must give weight to the cultural and ethnic institutions that are a part of their country. It would be difficult for a minimalist government to have an extremely complex tax structure because they just simply do not have the capacity to do this. The next is the credibility constraint, also known as the time consistency or inconsistent constraint. The credibility constraint is observing that governments work over some period of time, I hope. Governments and citizens have changing preferences during this time that might be related to the business cycle or the growth strategy or, economic conflict or corruption. All of these things come into account. So let's think about it this way. The government is setting up raising taxes for the next 8 years. And then about 4 years in, there comes a recession. The government and people now have changes in their preferences where individuals don't want to pay as much in taxes, and the government wants to cut taxes as a fiscal stimulus. and then it wants to spend more, which would, impart that tax increase later under, a Keynesian framework. And so this goes into how a government is constrained over some time period. The last is political constraint. And this is one that can't be overlooked, even though it often is for some reason. This is public economics as well as public finance. Anything that says public in front of it is necessarily political. Think about it this way. We live in America, or I live in America. That's roughly 330 million people. And all of them have their own individual preferences, culture, and beliefs about what the role of the government is. So, can the government act on behalf of a single individual? Sure. It's not efficient. It's not good. So, it must act in the best interest of the majority, just by the nature of being a large system. And we typically call this the median voter rule. Another relevant criticism of the Laffer curve is that it kind of assumes a single tax rate and a single labor supply. It mainly focuses on labor, income, and taxation, and this is where it kind of breaks down in its use in actual economics, because we know that tax rates in public finance are far more complex based on information of the government's constraints. So an example would be the corporate tax rate structure. How does that go? If we add that in, as well as capital gains tax, marginal tax rates, all of that, it becomes far more complex. And then we're looking at tax structures for individuals versus families. It keeps building up. And that's a big problem with the Laffer curve because it just kind of assumes just a baseline taste. But there's something I want to point out about the Laffer curve. It's not entirely pointless. And a lot of people that you see that attack it with such veracity, they typically do not understand what Laffer and other economists such as Thomas Piketty and Saez are really trying to get across with this notion. Laffer had come up with a good way to think about how individuals structure their life around taxes, because I think we all must agree that taxes are ubiquitous. Just about everything you do or don't do is taxed. This goes with the famous quote from Ben Franklin: "In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." So the utility of the Laffer curve is to get a taste or a preference that the society has for taxes. It's not the most advanced, it's not the most complex, but it does give a real basic interpretation of how taxes are viewed by society at large. There are going to be people, depending on their disposition, that will believe that taxes could be increased, and others that would find taxes to be revenue maximizing and the decrease. And this is an important takeaway from the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve in general is a true statement if we want to apply just some basic logic to it. At 0% taxation, a government revenue will be zero. At 100% taxation, government revenue will be zero. Under those two basic ideas, we can say that there is some point on the curve that maximizes the government's revenue and does the least amount of damage to the private sector. Now, when we get into more complex tax structures, we're going to need to incorporate preferences and aggregate up from a single utility function, and then getting how taxes affect consumption, and then the social welfare function. Because when we think about taxes, there are three responses that are typically studied by economists. They're the mechanical, behavioral, and welfare. And thus, we can come to some different conclusions for optimizing tax rates. But that is for another day. This is the Economicon. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. And please do like, share, and subscribe.